Okay, welcome to the third lecture. It's called Seeing the Value in Art. So some of the main themes that we'll see in this particular lecture are art and its reception. When I talk about reception, they're mostly talking about the public, but also critics, art, politics, and public space. And we'll look at three public sculptures and see what the public reception was. The other public art, and you'll see what that's all about. Works in progress, Guillermo Gomez Peña's Temple of Confessions, and then the critical process, which I do at the end of these, thinking about the value of art. So in this one, we're looking at Chris O'Feely's The Holy Virgin Mary. And this particular, Chris O'Feely, by the way, is British, but his parents are from Africa. And that's kind of where some of the influences are coming with this one. This particular painting was part of a show called Sensation, young British artists from the Saatchi collection at the Brooklyn Museum in New York City. And Young British Artists is the name of a group of artists that includes O'Feely and Damien Hirst, who is currently the world's wealthiest artist, but he wasn't at this time. So O'Feely's parents were raised in Africa, and O'Feely was born in England, though. And you can kind of notice that he has under here, and you probably might have noticed it in the list of materials, that on here, there's two pieces of elephant dung, and one says virgin, the other one says Mary. If you're not familiar with dung is, it just means poop. And O'Feely talks about how these particular works, that they're delicate abstractions, and it represents his kind of discomfort. So he had grown up as a Catholic, and he was an altar boy, and he would see a lot of pieces of the Virgin Mary. And if you're not familiar, Christians believe that the Virgin Mary is a woman who gave birth to Jesus, who Christians believe is a God, and she did so without having sex first. So they call her the Virgin Mary. And he talked about how when he would see these pictures, sometimes he thought they were kind of the Virgin Mary. Sometimes he thought they were kind of erotic. But he also is still a believer. When he was making these pieces, he was a believer. But he also thought about how, where his parents are from in Africa, that his parents were Catholic, and they embraced Christianity and were big fans of Jesus. However, Catholicism and Christianity in general, through missionaries, had been one of the tools of British and later American imperialism in Africa. So this is a very difficult relationship that he has with Christianity and with some of the imagery. So what he also included in here, besides the picture of Mary, were pictures that he cut out from pornographic magazines, and you can see of butts. So he was kind of recognizing this contradiction of someone who gave birth despite being never having sex, and then someone who he perceived to be erotic in some of the pictures he would see in church, compared to she's supposed to be the Virgin Mary. So he wanted to express that kind of like those contradictions in this picture. But as you might imagine, in Brooklyn, there were some people, mostly in the Catholic community, including Rudy Giuliani, who you probably know who he is. At this time, he was the Attorney General in Brooklyn. And some people came to him and they used their influence to try to stop this particular piece from being shown at the Brooklyn Museum. And the reasoning for that was they said it was publicly funded, and this was something that was blasphemous. They actually failed, and they weren't able to stop the picture from being shown. And we're seeing Chris O'Feely in his class, so it didn't hurt him much either. But other people weren't satisfied with that. There was one artist who's still around today, who he wanted to go and throw poop on this particular painting. So he got some horse manure, and he showed up at the Brooklyn Museum, but the security guard saw him coming and they moved in, and he just kind of threw the poop at the sidewalk, and didn't even hit the building. And then he was arrested, but it worked out well for him too, because now he does a lot of patriotic paintings. So for Chrysophilia, he had a bunch of different influences. Again, influences that are contradictions. He's influenced by Ethiopian portrayals of the Virgin Mary, where they show the Virgin Mary as Black, which is very common. Societies will show the Virgin Mary and Jesus as being similar to the ethnicity of wherever they're located. But he was also influenced by racist imagery that's used in England and also in South Africa. And that's where he got the symbol of the face. So again, recognizing this kind of contradiction where he embraces and loves the ideas of Christianity, but recognizes the history of it being used for repression and oppression. So this is one of those cases, kind of like what we saw with Mapplethorpe, where the artist kind of won out, and we get to see it in this class nowadays. By the way, he has other works, which I'll probably talk about later on, that are very cool. To see this in detail is kind of amazing because it's more than just a painting, and more than just a bunch of magazine pictures. So we'll see him a little later in the class and see more about his work. So we're talking about art and its reception. And Suzanne Lacy, who's an artist herself, she came up with this idea of how do artists function in relation to the audience that's receiving them. So this is from her Mapping the Terrain, New Genre Public Art. And she looks at art as being private on one, and this is just two-dimensional, on one side of the scale, and then public on the other side of the scale. So this talks about, when you're talking about private, a lot of this is the experience of the artist, or perhaps the people that are closest to the artist. So the most private is artist as experiencer, how they see the world. And then you have, getting more towards public, artist as reporter. And with that, that just means the artist is taking their experience and reporting it through their art. And by reporting, they mean they're not adding any, or trying not to add any meaning or any comment with it. And then getting closer to the public, the artist is an analyst. So not only are they using their experience and reporting it, but they're trying to make things that explain the world. And then the last one, and this is what Lacy tried to do, the artist is activist. So the artist is activist, is experiencing the world, they're reporting it, they're analyzing it, but they don't want it to just sit there. They actually want to change the world. That's what artist as activist means. So like chapter 1, we talked about some of these themes. We can see that the artist can kind of move from their own feelings to communicating things. And again, in the case of activists, hopefully change the world. So on one side, the artist is experiencer and reporter. That's aesthetic, meaning it's just what you see, versus transformation, which means they're trying to change things. So sometimes artists will have their own ideas and experiences and start to analyze things. And over time, it'll change things, even if they don't feel that they're activists or anything like that. So this is Edouard Manet, The Luncheon on the Grass, the Déjeuner sur l'herbe, if you prefer the French. And you can see it's from 1863. And when he first tried to get this picture into what's called the Paris Exposition, and at the Paris Exposition, they would have a salon. And a salon means that they have a whole lot of paintings covering the walls from the ceiling to the ground. And what you would do to get into the salon at the Paris Exposition is there would be a bunch of people at art schools and some artists, and they would judge your painting. And if they thought it was pretty good, you would get into the salon. they thought it was really good, they put you in a good spot so everybody could see it. So this show was kind of unusual at the time because it was open to the public, and they had been doing it for 100 years. Most of the art that we look at in this class before the beginning of the 19th century was not intended for the public. So this was kind of an art education in a way. So this particular painting was turned down for the Salon. And they actually, after turning down so many people, the Paris Exposition set up this Salon de Refusé, which means which means salon of garbage. But it turned out after a while that the Salon de Refusé was more popular than the actual salon itself. So eventually they changed the rules, and the very next year when Monet put in a different painting, he got into the regular salon. So that's one of the ways that you can change it. But let's try to think about, and you might want to pause it here, think about what might the judges have, why might they have a problem with this particular piece? And there's a bunch of different ways you can look at this. It can either be they have a problem with the form, meaning, you know, the lines and the colors and the space and realism and stuff like that, or they have a problem with the content, so the meaning. So take a pause, and if you want to, you can take it to the extra credit board as well, and try to think of some of the problems they might have. Okay, when you're ready to start, then I'll start explaining some of the things that other classes usually come up with. So usually the first thing they notice is that there's two young men who are fully clothed, and they're sitting in a park, it looks like, somewhere. And then there's one woman who's looking straight at us, and she's fully naked. So that is kind of a problem, but it's a more specific problem than her being naked. So we can kind of illustrate it here. If Monet had done what is done in this painting, which is Giorgione's Pastoral Symphony, he would be okay. And I'll explain why. In this painting, you're meant to see the nude female figures as being symbols, and you're meant to see that they're not actually there. So the subject of the painting is these two young men who are composing poetry, and back then poetry was always to song. And these women represent the ideas of creativity. So we see a woman, and she's holding a flute, and that represents poets. And then we see another woman who's taking water from a fountain, and that represents the fountain of creativity. The figures are also not very realistic looking. They're very soft. It's almost like they have no bones. They're very idealized for the time. And you can see the men don't pay attention to them, and they don't look at the viewer. So that's the acceptable way to do a painting like this. But what Monet did is quite different. We see that the female figure is staring straight at us. So we get the feeling she's real. And she's also interspersed with the men that are sitting here. So we get the feeling that she's actually there. There isn't, looks like they're having a spirited conversation, but there isn't anything to show that, you know, they're engaging in some kind of creative act. So that was one of the problems they had. A lot of people saw it, and some critics looked at it and they said, basically the way they would say it in modern language is there's a couple of frat boys who think they're playing a joke on everybody by having a naked girl in the park. And all of the people, by the way, in this picture are all friends of Monet, including the female model, who's also a painter herself, and she volunteered for this and understood what it was all about. So that's one of the problems they had. They thought it was kind of crude. One of the other problems they had was the way that he makes the picture wasn't realistic. So if you look at this figure in the back, who's kind of a substitute for the figure here, think about what would happen. She's far in the background. If she walked up to these figures, she would be about 20 feet high, because if you see things in the background, they should be smaller. But Monet purposely made her the same size as all the rest of the figures, so that part of the idea, and Manet was part of a group called Realism, which we'll talk about in more detail in the last session of the course. And the realists, they didn't just think that they should show things that are real, as in things that happen in real life. So this is some people having a picnic, probably not too many picnics where where one person is naked and the rest of them are clothed. But it is kind of a real event and not a religious or historical event or something like that. So that was one thing. They like to have realistic subjects. But the other thing is they believed it was realistic to show how paintings work. In other words, paintings, and it seems obvious to say, but it was something that you weren't allowed to do. Paintings are two-dimensional, and then you use some visual tricks to make them look like they're three-dimensional when you can walk into them. And since the Renaissance, that was the goal. And the people that were the judges for the Salon at the Paris Exposition thought that if you made something that didn't match, that didn't look right, it didn't have proper perspective and didn't look three-dimensional, that was the wrong way to do it. And the last problem they have with it, you can notice some of the painting is done pretty well, pretty gracefully. And then a lot of the painting in the background looks like it's just sloppy and unfinished. And again, for Monet, that was like realistic because he's showing how paintings work. They're actually made out of paint and we make strokes. So he showed, here's the trick. And then here's what it looks like before we get there. So for Monet, this is realistic because he's having just an everyday subject thing, not some kind of like kings or queens or something like that. And he's also showing how painting works. So he's being realistic in that way. I think that if the judges understood what Manet was doing, they might have let him in. And indeed, they did eventually in the next year, but that might be because of popularity. But one of the things he was influenced, and you can see how he takes the composition of these three figures from this picture, which is the Judgement of Paris. It's a story from ancient Rome. And the artist we have here is Marco Dente da Ravenna, but it was originally done by Raphael, the Renaissance artist. And generally, the judges of the Salon would love this kind of thing because they loved allusions, which means references to earlier works of art. And that's one way you can make your art look important. So this is a good example of artists being avant-garde, meaning they're ahead of what either the public actually wanted it, or the critics want. So in this case, being avant-garde actually won over the public first, and then changed the institutions that judge art and display it. So this is another example, except in this one, some critics were fans of it, and then some critics weren't, and then a lot of the audience didn't really understand what was going on, didn't like it so much. So this is Marcel Duchamp, and it's the nude descending a staircase, number 2. And you're probably looking at it and thinking, I don't see it. But if you look closely, think about if you were to take a series of pictures of a figure and then just paste them all onto one picture. And what you would see is the movement of the figure. And that's what Marcel Duchamp wanted to show. Not just the figure standing in place, but literally each piece of the movement. And part of it is he was really interested in photography, photography like this that was done by Muybridge, where they would have multiple cameras and it would show the motion of figures. Also pictures like this from Etienne Jules Marais, where he did a similar thing to the previous photographs, except he put all of the photographs on one piece of paper. And he also had the, it was mostly athletes that he was taking pictures of. He had the athletes wear all black except for a white stripe on their clothes. So this is an example of what it looked like. And what Marais was doing here is taking advantage of photography. Unlike our own eyes, photography is really bad at seeing things where there's really bright things in the frame and really dark things in the frame. So an example is if you look at photographs from the moon landings in the 60s and the 70s, you'll notice that you can't see any stars. But when the astronauts were there on the moon, they could see tons of stars. And that's because cameras just can't see very bright things and very dark things at the same time. So Murray took advantage of that to kind of show motion in what he intended to be a scientific way. But artists became interested in it because it was a new way of portraying things, and artists love new ways of doing things. So when this was shown in New York, it was 1913. At the time, the United States was seen to be kind of conservative, and the art world was seen to be kind of conservative. And it was kind of thought that Paris, especially, was the avant-garde. And a lot of the audiences and critics that saw this show, which was called the Armory Show, saw it and they said, "What the hell is this? This doesn't make any sense at all." And this is an example, the Rude descending a staircase, seeing New York with a cubist. They called his work cubist. I think he would have called it futurism at that time. And they're kind of making fun of what he's doing. But they actually, I think, based on this cartoon, understand what's strong about his particular painting. That when you do this kind of technique, it kind of shows a lot of motion and energy. So, you can think of all these people crowded together being rude, and you can feel the motion and energy. So I don't know. I guess they maybe like burn themselves on this one. So this is another example of an art that originally, when it came out, a lot of people didn't like it, didn't think it was very worthy. And then over time, it became almost universally embraced. And this is one of the most visited places in the mall in Washington, D.C., which is an area with a lot of monuments. So it was designed by Maya Yingwyn, who's Chinese American. And I think she was only 21 years old when she designed this. She won a contest. So he's 20 years old, sorry. A national competition for the Vietnam Memorial. And you can see she's a 20-year-old Yale graduate. So she graduated from high school early. And she actually had a very specific concepts behind this particular piece. And she had talked to a lot of veterans and to try to get some ideas. So if you're not familiar, the Vietnam War, as far as the United States, went on from about 1965 until 1973 or so. And the war began as far as U.S. involvement. First, the U.S. was involved even before 1965, covertly, with small numbers of people. They had to try to do things like assassinations and control elections. And if you're not familiar, Vietnam became a Marxist country, and the U.S. generally doesn't like that, and they went all around the world to try to stop these sorts of governments from getting power. So at first, it was just the U.S. supporting the anti-communists in Vietnam, and covertly, and then eventually they started to send more and more troops. And by 1968, there were 1 million troops, a couple million U.S. troops that were getting into the country. And the war, instead of ending, it kind of petered off. So by 1973, there were fewer and fewer people in it, and the U.S. withdrew. So if you're familiar with what is happening, if you're listening to this in 2021, the U.S. just recently got out of Afghanistan, and they did it in a pretty similar way to what they did in Vietnam, where there wasn't really a resolution. So the war, if you're not familiar, was heavily protested in the United States, especially when they started in towards the end of the 60s, drafting people who were still in college and taking them out of college and sending them to war. It used to be if you stayed in college, you could get out of the war. But they changed that. And then it was increasingly protested by more and more people. And many people, many of the things that happened in the Vietnam War, even more so than Afghanistan and Iraq nowadays, were shown on television. And many people saw some of the atrocities that were committed by US soldiers, but also they saw how unbalanced the war was, this extremely powerful state going into a small and less powerful country and trying to force them by killing them to change their government. So many people around the world and in the US saw this as unjust. So she took some of those ideas, and just to mention that in the war, somewhere between 2 and 3 million people were killed in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos by the US and their allies. And then there was just over 50,000 US soldiers killed. So very, very unbalanced war. And that's similar to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan as well. So she took some of these ideas and she made it into a long granite wall. And the granite wall starts out very small, and then it gets bigger and bigger towards the middle. And then it goes back to small again, which we can't see in this picture. So for her, that kind of showed how the Vietnam War went. It started with just a few people, and then it escalated to a high point and then petered off in the same way to a low point where there was just a few people. The other thing that she noticed is that she made it into kind of like a diamond shape a little bit. And if you see it from above, it looks like a gash that's in the ground because this particular piece just has ground above it, and then it's kind of dug into the ground. So for her, that was showing the injuries, not just to the soldiers whose names are written on the wall, but to the United States and its reputation around the world, and to the damage that was done in Southeast Asia and Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The last thing, so all of these names are US soldiers that died in Vietnam. And they actually have a book next to it where you can look up, if you have a relative, the name of your relative who died, and then you can find their name. And what became a tradition is people would take a piece of paper and a pencil and put it up against the name. And then if you rub the pencil, it'll on the paper, pressing it against the name, then you'll get a copy of the person's name. And my father had a cousin who died. It was really hard to find because my last name's Jones. And he did that. He got a piece of paper and did a rubbing. They also have a place to give gifts and such to the dead. And I noticed that popular gifts seem to be like beer. So probably old war buddies giving that. So when people first saw it, they didn't like it. And you can kind of figure out the reason why. When people thought of what war memorials were, they usually thought of it's a bunch of soldiers and they have weapons, or it's somebody on a horse and they have a weapon. It's surprising how many of those are. So people were expecting something like that, and instead they got this. So at first, some people were angry about it. But once people started to realize how it worked, the whole process of finding your person's name and then finding it on the wall, and the rubbings and the kind of ritualistic visiting that goes along with this, people really started to embrace it, and especially people who are either from Vietnam or who are Vietnam veterans. So the last thing, and this is the reason why I chose this picture, is she wanted to use granite, which is a very hard stone, which is a normal choice for something like this because it'll last forever, more or less. But she wanted to be highly polished. And the reason why is because she felt that the United States was a democracy, at least partially. and that the population has some control over the decisions the government makes. Um, you may not feel that way, and I'm not sure if I feel that way either. But she did want to show that there's a responsibility for everyone that is a U.S. citizen to, when there's an injustice happening, performed by the government to stop it. So when you go by the Vietnam Memorial, full of these names of dead, many who were like very, very young when they died, you see yourself. And Maya Lin is kind of saying, this is up to you to stop this from happening again. Obviously, in 2021, it's happened twice since then with Afghanistan and Iraq. So perhaps we have to go and visit this a little bit more and take stronger action. So a lot of public art pieces were kind of like the Vietnam Memorial, where when they were first made, they were not very popular or not understood. But eventually, over time, they were kind of embraced. So, sorry, let me skip from this, get back to the right slide. So this piece is Alexander Calder, La Grande Vitesse. If you're doing an in-person class, I'd ask how many people had seen it because it's in Grand Rapids and some people can see it. If you go to the Grand Rapids website right now, usually they'll have this pretty prominently displayed. And the piece, how it eventually got made, Alexander Calder was already a pretty famous artist. If you've seen his work, it's either been one of these public pieces or he has these basically mobiles that are in art museums and primary colors, so red, yellow, blue, and then white and black. So this one he chose red because primary colors. There's a reason why they have kids furniture in that color, because that really appeals to pretty much everyone. So this particular piece was actually funded by the National Endowment for the Arts. And the National Endowment for the Arts was originally grew out of programs from the Great Depression in the 1930s. But they started to move to support artists who were out of work during the Great Depression. Kind of like what was done, again, talking in 2021, where they tried to give extra unemployment to people during the COVID recession or depression. So the National Endowment for the Arts kind of moved from, they were still supporting artists with public money, which is pretty helpful, especially if you're doing avant-garde stuff. But they wanted to have more public art. The idea they had was that if you put things in places instead of museums, in places where people go all the time, outdoors, then people start to embrace different kinds of arts that they might not think of otherwise. So 1% of their money was going to art in public spaces. And this piece by Alexander Calder, La Grande Vitesse, was the first piece. And it's pretty expensive, but not too expensive. It's made out of metal, and the red paint is just industrial paint, and it's periodically painted. It's the same kind of stuff they use on bridges. And the idea with these art in public spaces was just to get people to see different ways of making art. So art for art's sake. And they weren't trying to make any particular statement beyond that. So it wasn't really a political statement. Since they felt they were public, they didn't want to lose their funding, so they didn't want to try to make a political statement. So when this piece was first made, people in Grand Rapids, a lot of them thought, wow, look, it's a giant red metal thing. Why do we have this now? And a lot of people thought it was kind of ridiculous or it wasn't art or whatnot. But over time, just like the plan for the National Endowment of the Arts, people walked by it and they started to embrace it. And they thought, this is really cool. You can walk underneath it. You can see in this slide, when you do, you can see Alexander Calder's signature on it. There's another one like this in front of the Toledo Museum of Art as well. It's very similar. And people started to realize, like, this is a different kind of experience than going to a museum and just standing in front of a painting. And this is a pretty cool experience. I think it'd be cool if you could climb on it, but they don't let you do that. There's art nowadays that's made like that. And not only did it change the way people looked at abstract art or non-objective art, Grand Rapids also kind of moved themselves towards being an artist community. And they have big art events every year. And they put a lot of public funding into studios for artists. And I've actually had students at Henry Ford College that have been able to get some of that funding and get some studios. So even though the National Endowment of the Arts, they were trying just to do art for art's sake and not be political, kind of turned out to have a pretty good effect for the lives of artists and for the lives of the people who live in Grand Rapids. So this one, I'm showing it, and I'm showing you controversial pieces, and you're probably thinking, why is this one controversial? You see this in every art class. It's considered to be a great masterpiece. It's by Michelangelo, and it's his sculpture of David. So before Michelangelo's time, there had only been one other David that was done in a similar way to what he was doing, nude, in other words. And when he was making it in 1501, 1504, it wasn't quite accepted yet to have figures from the Bible being portrayed nude. But he had a couple of reasons for doing it. First off, I'll just kind of summarize the David and Goliath story so you can get an idea what's going on. I had told it before in the previous lecture. So if you remember in the previous lecture, I talked about the David and Goliath story, and we looked at a couple of different paintings portraying that subject. So what Michelangelo wanted to do in the David Goliath story was to show David right as he is about to face Goliath. So before anything happens, basically. And the reason why he chose a nude is because Michelangelo and other artists have been looking at ancient Greece and Rome, and they had used the male nude to represent heroism, goodness. And by goodness, I mean like a philosophically good type of person. In the Bible, David is kind of seen to have a power, despite being, although he looks like a pretty grown-up man in this one, in the Bible, he's only a teenager. And in the Bible, they explain that the reason why he was able to defeat Goliath isn't just because he's some Bart Simpson like wily teenager. It's because he did it through the grace of God. So basically God gave him the power to do this. And he thought the heroic nude kind of represented that idea of a power beyond someone, because in ancient Greece, the male nude wasn't supposed to represent a particular person. It was supposed to represent this idea of perfection and heroism. And there's actually a lot of relationships between this and the city of Florence and how they saw themselves as kind of the small David against the larger, more powerful states like Milan, who they had defeated in wars. So Michelangelo used this block of marble that had a name before it was even used, called Giant, a huge block of marble. And someone else tried to work on it and said, I'm not worthy, more or less. And Michelangelo, despite being pretty young himself, I think he's like 25 years old or so when he's making this piece, he took it on and he carved out David. And this is a serious thing because marble is rather brittle. And if he had made a mistake, he would have ruined this giant thing. So if you look at old art books, it'll say that it's 13.5 feet tall. And that's actually wrong. It was just a long time ago. Somebody had made a mistake with the height, and that just kept getting repeated. It wasn't until the digital Michelangelo project in the mid 2000s where they wanted to do a 3-dimensional laser scan of it, which they did. You can actually get 3D printed versions of this David that are exact copies from the scan. And when they brought this rig to scan it, it was only 13.5 feet high. And when they put it up to it, they noticed it only came up to his shoulder. So they measure it with a tape measure. And that's why everybody says it's 70 feet high, because it actually is. But as you might imagine, when people first saw the nude figure, it was outdoors. It's not outdoors anymore because they want to save it from the bird poop. But it was outdoors, and people still weren't ready to have a religious figure and have them be nude. So even despite all of those ideas that I explained, and those ideas were out there more and more, it wasn't accepted because they thought it was uncouth to have a nude biblical figure. And it's also not accurate to the biblical story because David was wearing clothes. But again, Michelangelo wanted to use the nude to show the idea of this grace of God that David had. So some of these are, and obviously since then, this piece is seen to be one of the greatest masterpieces of European art. So I guess it worked out, right? So the other public art, we're talking about things that are a little bit more recent, and it really speaks to Lacey's activist role that we were talking about in the beginning, and even beyond activists. And this one's like literally helping people. So this piece is made by, I'm not very good with Polish, but Polish students said it's Krzysztof Wodiszko. Sorry if I murdered that. And it's his homeless vehicle, which he made in 1988. I'll just use his first name, which I don't usually do because it's easier to pronounce. Krzysztof was a Polish immigrant in the late 80s. And when he left Poland, it was actually a satellite state of the Soviet Union, which is now Russia. The smaller version is now Russia. And at that time, the Soviet Union had kind of like occupied much of Eastern Europe. And their idea was to kind of protect themselves from getting invaded like they were with the Nazis. But they also used their influence to make sure that all of the governments were kind of acceptable to the Soviet Union. So they were all Marxist governments. And so they got a lot of like kind of like Soviet propaganda about the US. In case you're wondering, the US has tons of propaganda about the Soviet Union at the same time. So some of the propaganda they would say is that, you know, you go to New York and the streets are paved with gold and you have all these like wealthy people and blah, blah, blah. And, you know, but then if you go away from the city, no one's being taken care of and it's full of really poor people, which in some ways nowadays actually probably isn't very wrong. But at the time, there was actually a huge homeless population. There still is today in New York, but not quite as large. And when he first came here from Poland, he couldn't imagine that a country this wealthy and the wealthiest city in this country could have so many people that were desperate and couldn't even have a house. And he just thought of like the indignity of not being able to go to a home and have privacy and to be able to do basic things like bathe yourself and be able to go to the bathroom without anyone looking. So he was inspired to make this thing, and he mass produced it, like hundreds of these things, his homeless vehicle. And basically what it does is it allows, and he just like put them out there and let like homeless people just claim them as they went along. So they could sleep on the inside and get some privacy that way. They could have a place where they could sit down and eat, and another place where they could wash. And if you've ever known anyone that's been homeless, like washing is often the most difficult thing after going to the bathroom. So he wanted to kind of like give some dignity. It might have been kind of better if he worked with the city to try to get people homes. But at that time, there wasn't much organization that was getting close to that yet. So this was this kind of artist way of looking at it. And the orange flag is so that people don't run it over, basically. So another one where artists are going out into the public. This is Suzanne Lacey, who we talked about before, and Leslie Leibowitz. And it's called In Mourning and Enrage. And it's in 1977. And it's a reference to a couple of things. They did this particular work where it's a performance art piece where they had these costumes with these feminine figures, and I'm not sure if they're all women because they wanted to make them look as tall as possible. There might be some men in here, but they're feminine figures. And there's the same number of them that represent the female victims of the Hillside Strangler. And they're dressed in mourning clothes, but again, they have this kind of piece that makes them look very, very tall. And that's good because some people can see it from far away. And in this, Suzanne Lacey is basically filling all of her roles. So the first thing is the experience of someone like the Hillside Strangler. Most serial killers will attack women because they're more vulnerable, especially sex workers, because they're even more vulnerable. And whenever there are serial killers, in some ways, all women can feel vulnerable, even if they're not like the victims. Then that's kind of one level. But the other level is the way the media treated these kinds of stories. People like Suzanne Lacey and Leslie Leibowitz thought that they took these stories and got into all the gory details. And in some ways, even though they were reporting these murders as they should be, they believe that some of the reporting kind of almost reveled like a horror movie and women being killed. And they thought that it should be reported in a way that isn't so exploitative towards the victims. So that's the idea they had with going to this. And they set it up so there'd be media there and people would be taking pictures. You can see there's video right there. And that way they could talk about it afterwards and they could let people know, hey, this is a feeling, all of us are vulnerable, but it's also saying something to you, the media. You have to change the way you talk about these types of murders. So in Mourning and Enrage. So thinking about the value of art, this is group material, which is a group of artists and others who wanted to recognize what was going on in the 80s. And that was the AIDS pandemic, which is still ongoing today. But in the late 80s, at the time, from the time that the disease was first recognized as being a particular disease and it was identified that HIV caused it, that happened from the late 70s, early 80s to the mid 80s when HIV was identified as the cause of AIDS. But what was interesting, the president at that time was pretty right wing, and I would say it's fair to say that he was pretty anti-gay. It was Ronald Reagan. And whenever the disease first presented itself, doctors were mostly noticing it in gay men. And then later they noticed it in people who used heroin. And it was later found out that's just because it's really hard to spread AIDS and it spreads through blood contact. So when it was first happening, it was a death sentence. Like nobody survived AIDS at that time. Nowadays, people can be treated for it. But at that time, if you developed AIDS, you were going to die. And it became a worldwide pandemic throughout the 80s. And since then, millions of people have died from AIDS. But the president of the United States at that time literally said nothing about it the entire time he was president. So this is huge growing pandemic and he said nothing. And most people perceive that as him being representing what some other kind of like right-wing folks were saying at that time, that it was some kind of punishment from God for gay men. So he never talked about it at all, despite it being this huge growing problem. And the media didn't do the best job of talking about it either, although they eventually got better. So the idea with this was the show kind of like how the AIDS virus developed, how it was shown at that time, how it kind of grew from this relatively small population to being this worldwide pandemic. He also wanted to show some mementos from the people that died, so that you could see, hey, these are like real people that died with real lives and people that loved them. So that was part of the idea, to kind of like teach people about how it went along, and not spare some of the folks that said bad things about it. This is a picture here of Jerry Falwell, who was one of those ministers that said this was a punishment from God. But also showing, art, and some of the reasons why AIDS spread and why there wasn't as much attention paid to it at first. So they eventually had another one, from the NAMES Project, which was the AIDS Memorial Quilt. And this is in 1989. The following president, George Bush, eventually did talk about AIDS. But projects like this were kind of a way to get politicians to start to take the AIDS pandemic seriously. So they made these quilts and they worked with families of people who had died from AIDS. And as you can see, they constructed it. You can't do this anymore, unfortunately. They constructed it on the White House outer lawn, and got lots of media attention for it. And this, along with other work, got attention to the AIDS virus, and eventually a lot of government money got into it. And effective treatments were found for it. So this is one of those cases where art was part of a movement to change the world. Not the only part, certainly, but part of the movement. So that's all for today.